Got to be optimistic, Selaine. Everyone else I think might have been a heart attack.
So Rebecca, because obviously was first with you, and then by the time we got to the third thing I was with, we were a good 20 minutes late. I said, don't worry, I said, you're stressed. I said, you're still pretty much on time. I said, compared to most of the conferences.
Yeah.
The latest one I've waited for was Rob Jenrick, who was 90 minutes late.
Goodness
There she is.
Oh.
Hello.
Please do come in. Thank you so much.
Oh no, God, no worries. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm slightly
Not a problem at all.
slightly late.
I'm Lynsey. I'll be
Hello, Lynsey. Yeah. All I need to say is Andrew Gilligan. He's always bloody late. Do you know him?
I don't know actually.
He's the Prime Minister's transport advisor.
Oh, yes, I do. I knew the name.
Yes, it's quite important in my life, but he's always sodding late.
Just practically, we only have one microphone between the two of you, so if you could just move it.
Yeah, I mean, although doesn't it, if it's sort of...
It's streamed, so... yeah.
Audience of thousands online.
Sorry?
Audience of thousands online.
Excellent.
Well, I think it's more for afterwards, so that we can make sure that it's available on...
Screen out the swear words. Hello, Matthew. Nice to meet you.
Wow, okay. Right, I think we're about ready to get going. Welcome and thank you everyone for coming. I'm Lynsey. I'm one of the climate programs managers at the Conservative Environment Network. Hopefully by now you already know what we do, but if you don't, we're the home for Conservatives pushing for decarbonisation and conservation. This is the penultimate event of SEN's conference programme. We've had 18 events. If you want to know more about it, there are little leaflets on your chairs, so please do take a look at that. This event in particular is all about travel in our towns and cities, the way that we get around, the infrastructure we use, and what this might look like in 10 years' time. Low carbon methods of transport like cycling and walking, e-scooters, public transport, they will all be necessary in our journey to achieving net zero by 2050. And the government's vision is for active travel and public transport to become primary method of travel. This panel is hopefully going to look at how we can achieve this practically and the challenges that we may face and have to overcome. I'm delighted to be joined by a wonderful panel of experts to discuss this issue. We have Baroness Vere, who is the Minister at the Department for Transport, responsible for roads, buses, taxis, and light rail. We have Selaine Saxby, a Member of Parliament for North Devon, a SEN active travel champion, and the chair of the APPG on walking and cycling. We have Councillor Jonathan Nunn, leader of West Northamptonshire Unitary Council. And we have Matthew Pencharz, head of policy for UK, Ireland, and the Netherlands for Voi Technology, one of Europe's largest shared micromobility operators and our sponsor for this event. So thank you very much for that, Matthew. We'll begin with some short opening remarks. We'll try and keep it brief, just to a couple minutes, followed by some questions from myself and from the audience. I'll begin with Baroness Vere. If you could tell us a little bit about your brief and how you see this evolving.
Yep, of course I will. And thanks very much for turning up to this afternoon. There's a gentleman here with a very large glass of red wine, and I'm insanely jealous. It's 4 o'clock, and he's on it, and I love it. I love it. So, my title is Minister for Roads, Buses and Places, and actually it's the places bit that is really interesting in this regard because it's devolution. So I am the person who, within transport, deals with all of the metro mayors. We look at, for example, Transforming Cities Fund, which went out to 20 big cities. So I have an awful lot to do with urban transport, and I have an awful lot of money to spend on it, which is also good, but don't tell Rishi, because, you know. But all being well, I'll still have a lot of money to spend on it. And the way we're looking at this is we've really got to get to the stage where we have the right mode for the right journey. And we're not there at the moment with our urban centres. They're basically just full of cars. And that's that. So what we've got to try and do is to encourage people and businesses to make those right choices. We aren't going to be able to use an entire series of sticks and just hammer them out of their cars and shove them into buses. It's not going to work that way. That will never work. People will hate it. We need to go with the grain of the population. So For passengers, clearly we want to move to a low-carbon, low-emission transport ecosystem where air quality is better within our big cities. And as part of that, of course, there will be a huge range of different transport modes, some of which we can envision now and some of which, quite frankly, are yet to be invented. On buses, we've made very good progress in terms of setting out our vision for buses going forward. I do have about £3 billion to invest in buses, which is a fair amount, and I'm very grateful. So, buses I think are going to be great, but they do rely on good bus corridors, because I want people who are sitting in cars complaining about the traffic, well, they are traffic, so don't complain, to see a bus going whizzing past them, a nice, clean, green, quiet bus that gets to their destination 10 minutes before they do, and they go, oh, why didn't I get the bus? So that's what we want. And also, we need buses to be integrated with really good mass transit systems where possible. Well aware that Leeds hasn't got one, but maybe one day it will. But linking into that, things like micromobility is really, really important, as is cycling and as is plain old walking. There's a huge amount that you can get from just walking around a city. So all of those things have to be interrelated. Now, I sit here as government with money, but actually, I can't give cities a great big master plan and say, right, I want you to do that, because we don't live in a communist society. What I need is for cities to step up and to give me really ambitious plans for how we can invest in all of these different modes to make these cities great and to make transport within those urban environments really, really good. And just one tiny winny thing for me, the last bit, and it's a really important thing actually, it's not tiny, and that is freight. There's been a thing in the news about HGV drivers. I don't know if you've seen it. It's a huge issue. And if we are going to maintain our high streets and improve our high streets to be places that people go to experience things, to buy things, we have to be really careful about freight and freight delivery. We don't want thousands of HGVs trundling down high streets. We've still got to make sure our shelves are stocked. So freight consolidation, using smaller vehicles to go to high streets where you consolidate with several delivery points together, all of those things are really important. But again, government can provide the guidance, can provide the ambition, and set the national direction, but we really do rely on places, and that's why places are so important.
Thank you very much. I'll move on to Selaine now.
Lovely, and thank you very much. And I feel a bit of a fraud being on this panel as the MP for North Devon, as one of the most rural constituencies in the country. But I am a CEN active travel champion, and I do chair the all-party parliamentary group for cycling and walking, and I do at least have a good-sized town in Barnstaple. So, but I think it's also quite important when people are planning sort of urban travel to think a little bit about how rural fits into it. So I did hear some conversations about the challenges of Manchester integrating its public transport network, and was just jealous that you had a public transport network, or even public transport, actually. And so I think it is important, I think, for us out in the country not to get left behind. But I also think it's quite important within the conversations to recognise that we can learn so much in towns from what is done in cities on a smaller scale, and how we bring those things with us. And I was asked particularly to reference cycling and walking, which I spend a lot of time looking at. And I think coming out of our last inquiry, we did think about talking about active travel, and I think it's certainly not partisan to be anti-cycling. It goes both sides of the house, and so, but most people are quite pro-walking. We don't have the same hostility towards walkers. So I think we're going to look to perhaps rebrand ourselves as active travel, and then just encourage people to move that bit more. I was a fitness instructor for 20 years, so I'm quite keen on moving generally, and come at it from that angle, but also as a CEN active travel champion, the decarbonisation options and opportunities that come from getting out of our cars are great, but we also need to recognise in constituencies like mine, people are not going to be walking to the supermarket anytime soon unless they've got a spare week to do it and are probably sponsored. So I think it is looking at what's the right transport mode, and what we're looking at very much out in the country is hubs. So to actually, if we have a limited bus service, that there's somewhere that you can perhaps drive to the bus if you have to, or cycle to the bus, so that we can actually replicate what you do in towns in the way that we do it out in the country. But for me, it's about bringing the community with you and creating space for you to do it in. And that I think where cycling and walking works best is where there is space for cycling and space for walking. And having been with the guide dogs this afternoon, I promised I'd mention, and space for people with guide dogs to walk as well. Because actually, any time that you go out with those people who do actually walk quite a lot with their guide dogs, the challenges they have when we have shared space. And I think one of the things from the pandemic that we've seen is where we have created space, we have seen more people using it and people now cycling in places that previously they'd have been scared. And one of the biggest issues we see with cycling is people are scared. And so once you can overcome that fear and give them that space, and that's not always possible in a crowded city centre. So there is a need for creativity and recognising that there are people who are vulnerable on our pavements and e-scooters and the like, which I'm a big fan of. We have the only rural e-scooter trial in the country running in Barnstaple. So we're learning from you in the cities.
Thanks so much, Selaine. Jonathan.
Yes, thank you very much. I wanted to comment on a couple of things, really. One is to sort of stress that I think local government has a really important role in reducing transport carbon. Also, I was going to tell you briefly about our experience of micro-mobility, which has been with e-scooters with Voy. I think, first of all, we're a brand new council. We were only formed in April as a new unitary, taking account of 3 districts and half of a county. So we're brand new in that respect. We immediately declared the climate emergency, the 2030 carbon neutral target, and with COP26 coming up, we are working on a sustainability strategy as well. We just think these are important things to do. So that's the backdrop to our attitudes and aspirations. But as somebody else has been saying recently, none of this is easy. It is incredibly hard. It's changes in behaviour, really, and changes to what people are used to in their daily lives. I have to say that some of our recent attempts to reduce carbon have not been entirely successful. Previously under the county council, before we became unitary, there were attempts to bid for active travel money. Some of those things, some are still running, but some have fallen away. The bus lanes, 24 hours, some of them just resulted in more queuing traffic with engines idling. So the obvious answer is not the immediate answer. They take a little time to make them work. We're sticking at them. We're absolutely sticking at them. But these things are not easy. In a way, because of the marvellous opportunity, the government money was made available to some extent. Schemes were thrown in, and they included making roads one way to include cycle lanes, which actually included a road very near the hospital. So that just wasn't going to work for ambulances. But we're now taking a more considered look at some of these things, and what some of these more considered things mean is making improvements at important road junctions to make walking possible and more practical. We have a senior school, Northampton School for Boys, where it's really hard to walk back from school because there is a junction with no pedestrian crossing, so investing money in that to make that a safe and a far more attractive route to walk home from school. We're also looking at our cycle network and where the gaps are in that, because that's kind of arrived in a fairly haphazard way with little bits of cyclable turf here and there that come to an end. So if we can connect the town, particularly I'm thinking of Northampton, which is our larger urban area, a town of 225,000 people, so it's one of the largest towns in the country, or indeed in Europe. If we can connect that up and make cycling an attractive alternative. We're also busy writing a bus improvement plan, which is looking at every aspect of buses, from the convenience of ticketing to more demand responsive bus routes and so on. One of the challenges we have, like many councils, is that when a new development arrives, some of the developer contribution of 106 money goes towards bus provision. Some of that's running out. And it's a real challenge to replace it at the moment in order to do that. But we're determined to do that, and we know there are opportunities to bid to government for support to that. So we'll be continuing to do that. So we stand with a commitment completely to reducing transport carbon in every possible way we can. Final thing is that we have reduced transport significantly as a result of being based in the middle of the country. Northampton has a huge logistics trade, and actually the logistics trade has done a lot to reduce its carbon. So we have measured that our overall reduction in carbon in the town of Northampton in the last 5 years is somewhere in the proportion of 45%. So that's a really encouraging figure for people who are sitting here thinking, have we actually started on anything? We have, and we've been able to do quite a chunk of that in Northampton. Just talk to you about our experience then of micro-mobility and e-scooters and the partnership arrangements we have that, in my view, have worked successfully with Voy. But again, nothing new you do is easy, is it? You're changing people's habits. And it's worth saying, if I paint a picture of the start, most people didn't think this was going to work. And some degree, the reason for this was, well, they look like scooters, they look like something the kid might get for Christmas, but actually these are motorised road vehicles. these are really serious bits of kit, and they have to be used. They have to be used that way. And we saw initially some safety concerns. We even saw underage people using them, not sure how. You needed a driving licence, but I think driving licences were disappearing from mum's handbags all over the town, and that's somehow, that's been resolved now. More safety measures have been put in. We're seeing 2 riders on one scooter disobeying the road rules, a lot of joy riding and even, say, antisocial behaviour. But we've worked to keep at this. I'm aware of some councils who have dropped their trials on this. You can't do that. You've got to stick at it because there's few alternatives. And this is one that really can work. So through education, through enforcement, through tightening up the processes as Vere have, the way in which you have to scan a photo of yourself in order to qualify, scan a copy of your driving licence to register. These are really tightening the processes up. The GPS has meant that the scooters slow down in pedestrianised areas, and we've worked hard with Vere to do that. Little initiatives like registration numbers. There's a 4-digit registration on every scooter now, so they can more easily be reported. And Vere have various different policies for banning people, or a 3 strikes and you're out policy, and all these sorts of things. So these things are really now starting to work. So we would say to any council considering this, keep communicating with the operator, and not just through your officers. Make sure your members' views are really coming across as members of the people who get the complaints on these sorts of things, and just make it a completely open dialogue. We are now replacing car use with these scooters. And it's sensible usage. The people that you see using them and the way in which they're using them is really sensible replacing. So we know that since this trial has operated for 13 months, there have been 1 million miles travelled on these scooters, a very significant proportion of which has replaced car journeys. And that equates to 32,000 users, replacing probably 170 tonnes of carbon. So the trial's just been extended, and it's something that we would consider wanting to continue to do. It's a pioneering thing. It's not been easy to keep it going, but we're really glad we have, and we consider it to have been a success. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And finally, just for some introductory remarks, Matthew.
Thank you very much, Lynsey, and thank you very much for having us here on the panel. So Vere is the largest UK and continental micromobility operator. We were founded, in fact, just 3 years ago, but we're now operating in 70 cities across 11 countries. And here in the UK, we're operating in 17 town cities across the UK, including Northamptonshire, but also places like Bristol, Liverpool, Birmingham, Oxford, Cambridge, etc. And we've got about 60% of the market here, so we're the largest operator. But we've had 5.5 million rides in the year or so in which we've been operating, replacing around 2 million cars. So we really are helping to give people options to not do that car journey, that single occupancy car journey that causes so much congestion. And in fact, last week, with the background of the fuel protests, obviously, not protests, sorry, I'm thinking about 20 years ago, the fuel supply problems that obviously the country's seen, and also, I think, some rather nice weather, we had our rides increasing by 44% in that period. And I used to work with Boris Johnson when he was mayor, and whenever there was a strike, very painful that they were, there was a somewhat silver lining to the tube strikes, in that people found new ways to get to work, and a number of them then didn't go back to however they did it before. So we're obviously hopeful that some of those 44%, and I'm not going to pretend it's going to be all 44%, will obviously remain as Vere users to use that sustainable, affordable and safe form of transport. And when you think about the scale of the challenge we have, where 27% of our emissions are arising from transport, over half of that from cars and taxis, and car ownership, in fact, is the highest that it's been, despite a lot of the measures that successive governments have been taken, you can see that there's quite a lot of work to be done. And in the last decade, we've seen urban traffic increase by about 25%. So it's a problem that I suppose has increased recently. And then when you think that 60% of car journeys are between 1 and 2 kilometres, and 20% of them are under 1 kilometre. Now, I'm not going to equally sit here and say all of those can be walked or cycled or scooted. Clearly, that isn't the case, but a lot of them can be, probably the majority. And with the government's transport decarbonisation plan saying that 50% of urban journeys should be done by active modes by 2030, you can see that you've got to give people lots of options. And to the Minister's point, you can't wield a big stick and corral people, communist style or socialist style, onto buses. You need to give residents different options and the freedom to choose different ways to travel in order to start to meet those targets, to make our cities more fit for living with less congestion, but also using less and more space for people, and seek to hit those carbon targets. And in our operations, and we did a big survey of 9,000 of our users, 39% of them would otherwise have taken a taxi or a car. So it shows you that we really are delivering that modal shift, that offer. And that's a great deal higher, interestingly, than our continental markets. It's only around 14%. But you think about that we are generally more car-centric with a poorer public transport offer, you can see that it's a new mode as being a great new way for people to get around in that sustainable offer. I'm not going to say it's been perfect, and Jonathan has sort of referred to some issues that us and all operators have met. It's hard to bring in a new form of transport. But the novelty value has definitely worn off. Our user base is now increasing in age. It isn't just the early adopters of people in their late teens and their 20s, but people in their 30s and even greybeards like me in their 40s. And it's very reflective of, in fact, the local demographics. So where do you see perhaps some cycling tends to, you hear reading the newspapers, that often is quite a white and a male thing to do. Micromobility really does mirror the ethnic makeup of our cities. And I quite geekily went through all the ONS statistics against what our respondents had said, and within a few percentage points, it mirrored very much the local community. So we're really helping to drive modal shift among communities that perhaps have been more difficult than it has been in the past. And we've seen them reactivating high streets, getting people to work. Anecdotally, we go and talk to the people working around where we have our safety events in towns and cities, and they often say, I've been using it to travel to work. And in fact, this gentleman here is a fan himself and says that's how he gets into town in Northampton. Although I think you said your wife wasn't very happy with the bills appearing on his bank statement. But it is very affordable, though, I should say. but it's pleasing to hear sort of users saying how much they enjoy it. We've got to hear today, in fact, that the government intends to extend the trials further beyond March 2022 next year through to next autumn into November. So we look forward to hearing more from the government, from the ministers, about quite what the ins and outs of what that actually means and some more details. And of course, what other measures the government will be bringing forward in their future transport bill, which we believe is going to Parliament sometime next year.
When it's written, yeah.
When it's written. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. Before I open it out to Q&A, and please do get thinking of some questions for our brilliant panel, I just wanted to pick up on something that I think a lot of you touched on, which is this kind of element of modal shift. And Jonathan, you mentioned the idling of buses, and actually that could mean a higher carbon emission from transport. Do we need to be discouraging car use as well as encouraging active travel? And I wonder if Baroness Vere, I could start with a few comments from you, perhaps.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a really difficult one, and it will depend on the area and what the demographic is like. Because in some places where you have very poor air quality, charging to use your car has worked very well. And it is right that those people who create the most pollution should actually pay for making that pollution. But it's also the case that for some people, switching out of a car is not an option. So I go back to what I said before. It is about the right mode for the right journey. And I thought Jonathan's points were very interesting about his experience of successes and things that didn't go quite so well. And if there's one thing we know about transport is everything takes a long time. It takes a long time to build stuff, it takes a long time to plan stuff, and then it takes a long time for things to be adopted. Very few of you will remember the time when cars first came onto the streets and you had a man with a white flag in front of the car because they were that dangerous. And so, all of these things do take time to be fully adopted, and I think that we have to rely on our great local authorities to stick with stuff. And occasionally it is going to be difficult, but ripping stuff out that the government has given you money to put in within a couple of months of putting it in is not going to find favour with me, I'm not going to lie. So, we really do need us to stick with it and try and bring people with you, and then they will see the benefits. And that is just, the challenge of transport. It doesn't move quickly, and we just need to try and stick with it as much as we possibly can.
Thank you. I think sort of leading on from that, the role of local consultation, I think you two might be able to offer some insight into this, but what roles do local active travel schemes play in this, and how does consulting with local people improve uptake of things like cycling and walking?
Shall I go first? Thank you. I was just going to add on to Charlotte's point about transport, and I think there's also, when we talk about moving towards net zero, as we move into hybrid and electric vehicles, and that actually what we desperately need in rural, and I heard from big fleet operators yesterday, even urban Britain, is more charging points, that if we actually, where people are prepared to buy electric, and many are, and increasingly I think this week have been grateful that they had electric cars, and that they actually do need to charge it. And when you live somewhere as rural as I do, I can't get across my constituency without a recharge, so that would be a point I'd like to make. And apologies to those of you who've heard me speak before, but when it comes to consultation, one of the things the APPG does, so please do come along and join us on walking and cycling, is hear from cities where some of these schemes have gone really well, and the need to bring communities with you and consult design with them in mind makes all the difference to their acceptance. As a lady who suggested closing a bridge into Barnstable after the pandemic so that people could cycle and walk, and received a death threat. So I would suggest that it's that's how we do things in North Devon. But it is worth getting your community on side before making great announcements. And I think there's a lot of best practice out there, that there are some very successful schemes in the country. And one of the joys of the APPG has been hearing from some of those. So please do, use us to learn from others.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's got to be a sort of hearts and minds thing in many ways, hasn't it? And it's about positive encouragement, getting people involved and feeling they're a part of the journey, I guess. One of the things we've got, again, as a new council, we're working this week and next week with groups on a climate strategy, and that's initially taking what we call mini summits. We've got one for young people, one for business, one for active groups, if you like. And this is a start to get something we can then go out to public consultation on as a sort of a straw man, if you like, strategy. And we hope that people will, feel inspired and embrace it and so on, because you just have to encourage. And this, I suppose, for me, slightly also is the difficulty in the sort of making the motor car more difficult rather than the attractiveness of the other alternatives. And I know that's hard, and it's a combination of both. So we also face, huge economic drivers that have to be considered, and there's a constant clash between preserving an old town that's seen its Marks and Spencers go and everything else go. We're repurposing it into more of a heritage type experience, but it's a constant appeal just to keep the economy of the town going, whereas those dedicated to their motor car have plenty of out of town options as well. So there's so many different facets to this that says actually you've got to make just talk about Northampton. You've got to make it a reason to come back in. Now we haven't got Marks and Spencers. It's because we've got a great new museum. We've suddenly got a lot of heritage experiences, and it's easy to get there, and you can get there low carbon. It's all got to be part of that package, really. And there's a bit of a paradox and a dilemma between these things. We've got to make it attractive for that whole day out and travel experience. Thank you.
Fab, thanks. Do we have any questions from the audience? Oh, a lot. There's a microphone at the back. The guy in the aisle, I spotted you first.
Thank you. Martin Bolt, the Conservative Group Leader on Transport in West Yorkshire. Active and sustainable transport is nothing new for Conservatives. We had a previous manifesto commitment that we would preserve and protect former rail lines in public ownership. 2014, we had a parliamentary debate from the APPG about Great Britain cycling. We then come forward to LTM 120 and gear change, so we've been developing things. But in West Yorkshire, Highways England have spent £7 million closing off Queensbury Railway Tunnel, which is a link between Calderdale and Bradford. Kirklees Council are spending £77 million on a highways scheme that conflicts with LTN 120 and isn't cycle-proofed on journeys. So the question is, what will government do about errant authorities and spendthrift authorities which are not delivering on our priorities?
Thank you. I think that might be a question that Baroness Vere, you could attempt to tackle.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure as the person responsible for national highways. And I also know a fair amount about Queensbury Tunnel as well, because it's been one of those really difficult decisions. Queensbury Tunnel, it's a long tunnel, it's very dangerous, and anyway. yeah, we are where we are with Queensbury Tunnel, but I think the most important thing is to try and find lots of different alternatives, given that we weren't able to keep it open as we had originally intended. But in the bigger picture is, what will government do? Well, actually, we were really clear about this in both gear change and I think in the National Bus Strategy as well, is that we won't just be looking at more funding for a particular mode. So if you're a local authority and you do something that we don't like, you rip out a bus lane that we've already paid for, it won't just mean that you won't get more bus money, but you might not get your bypass either. So what we are going to try and do is link in other types of transport spending. So ideally, what I would like to get to a stage is where we have basic, better, best, so just like Antiques Roadshow. So you have your basic local authorities who will get an amount, and they'll be sort of like they've got a C, they're a grade C. And then you have the better, because they're more ambitious, they've got more things, and we will give them more money. And then, of course, you've got the top class, the A stars, and they will be the best. And frankly, we will look more favourably on them for all sorts of different fundings. And I think the point is, because if you go back to cycling and walking, some local authority doesn't like cycling and walking, and we say, look, if you don't do that, you can't have any more cycling and walking money. What do? Oh, great. Don't have to take any more of that government money. But if I say, oh, well, you can't have any money for your potholes, conversation might change a little bit. So I think that's one of the sticks that we can do. But really, I don't really want to use that stick. I want everybody to come up with really ambitious plans, have a really good local transport plan that brings in all modes.
Great, yeah. We've got polka dot.
Polka dot.
Miss Conference Polka Dot 21. I'm a group leader in Enfield. I've known Matthew, who was a great deputy mayor when he worked for Boris when he was mayor of London. But I just want to go back on what you were talking about, consultation. If you have a low traffic neighbourhood scheme that has, when you do the consultation and the residents say, actually we've tried it, but actually it's not for us, and the local authority takes it out on the balance of the outcome of a genuine public consultation, will you be as robust as what you've just said about not giving other funding out if the local authority has genuinely listened to the outcome of a public consultation by the taxpayer?
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely depends on, obviously it's going to be a case-by-case basis, but it depends how long the LTN's been there for. Some of them are taken out really, really quickly, haven't had time to bed in. And what we do know, I mean, my friend and colleague Andrew Gilligan did quite a lot of, yeah, we love him. He did quite a lot of analysis around the local election results, particularly around cycleways and LTNs, and there was some sort of correlation between, people who were supporting them doing slightly better. And I think it's also worth, making sure that we consult with local businesses as well as to whether they feel that their environment for doing trade in is also better. But I think our biggest bugbear is the stuff that goes in and comes out really quickly, because it does have to have time to bed in. And then clearly, from a local consultation perspective, that's up to the local council to do, and we would work with you in terms of you saying, oh, well, it didn't work. And it may be that it didn't. I mean, not all of them are going to be right. We know that. But what we don't want is people either not trying or not trying and putting it in place for a period of time.
I think I might also ask Jonathan if you had any insight into this as well from a local authority perspective, and if you get a consultation result that perhaps you weren't expecting or were hoping for different results.
Yeah, it might be worth also saying my comments possibly slightly flippant at opening. We've had some successes, we've had some that haven't succeeded, but all supported, and we would gladly argue fully the consultation that's come from these schemes, and the whys and why nots, and I think perhaps the ambition was to bid and try lots and lots of different things, even those that perhaps seemed like an outside chance initially. But we have a pretty firm rationale supported by consultation for all those that don't look like they will be proceeding. There's one going out for consultation soon just to get that full view, but following sort of full, huge press campaigns and all sorts of things, petitions and so on. And all road issues are really challenging, aren't they? We're going out for a new highways contract, and the previous one has been stretched, and there are potholes and so on all over the place. There isn't an awful lot of money, really. We have to take I'd say collegiate approach with government to work at the best way of getting the best value for every single penny. I don't think our position is unique, but our roads are in. Some councils refer to the managed decline of roads, don't they? We just can't accept that that's the way we have to have them. We want to get people out of their cars. We want more sustainable transport, but we have to maintain the roads. We can't just see them. see them decline. I don't know if that's helpful at all.
Yeah, that is, thank you. I spotted a hand just over here. The gentleman in the funky socks.
It's stripes and spots. Building on the potholes theme, I work for Zurich Insurance Company, and we are one of the biggest local authority insurers in the country. And in the last 18 months, we've seen a really rapid rise in serious injury claims arising from cyclists, e-scooter users and pedestrians, where they've been walking along, cycling along, they've hit a pothole, they've come off, seriously injured themselves. As opposed to a decline in the number of car claims because there's been fewer cars out on the road, and obviously when one of those cars hits a pothole, the claim is only 50, 60, 70 quid. So does there need to be a reallocation of infrastructure spending so that we are fixing the potholes in the cycle paths, on the footpaths, as opposed to the middle of the highway? I know that's not going to be politically popular, but this is almost a life and death matter now that we're seeing a really serious rise very quickly.
Thank you. I wonder if perhaps Matthew, you can come in on the safety issue, and then Baroness Vere perhaps on the road network.
Well, when it comes to the safety of our service, it's broadly aligned with cycling. What we certainly have seen is the accidents have been reduced over time because it's a new form of transport. And in fact, our safety report said that 18% of the accidents we see are on the first ride. So once people have their first ride, you see accidents drop off, and that's what we've seen in more mature markets. But to the point around road safety and more generally, when we talk to our users, and we did the polling, which also came up with the demography of our users, very high up was infrastructure around segregated cycleways and to be safely separated from traffic. So there are lots and lots of understandable complaints of pavement riding by e-scooters. Generally, that is by private, unregulated and illegal e-scooters. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend that every Vore is driven on the road. Sometimes they are on the pavement, and that isn't acceptable. But for some of the users, it is because they are a little bit fearful of going on what are quite busy roads. So we certainly want to work with our councils like Northamptonshire, but in our other markets to help them in thinking around more segregated cycle paths with don't have potholes, and therefore it's giving people that what feels to be a much safer offer when it comes to getting out of those cars and travelling more sustainably.
When I became Roads Minister about two and a half years ago, I don't know when it was anyway, but I spent about a whole weekend, 2 whole days, looking at all the pots of funding. It's insane. It's insane how many pots and streams and types of funding we have for different things, and we have to stop it. We have to stop doing that. So one of the things that I then did was gather in 40 local authorities, and we had a bit of a round table session, and we had a chat about it, and I said, look, what do you want? And actually the thing they wanted more than anything else was multi-year funding, because it allows a local authority to plan. So what I would like to do is we would get to a stage where we have multi-year funding, but also we trim down the number of pots that we end up in, because what happens is you have your highways maintenance pot, so you go and fix your pothole, the next day you have your bus pot, and you go up and you rip up that entire bit and put a bus lane in. Well, that's just bloody waste of money. So what somehow we've got to do is try and consolidate to our best performing local authorities, ones where we know we're going to get great outcomes, and leave it up to them to make the decisions to spend the money as wisely as possible and to be able to plan to do so over many years.
Great, thank you. I think actually following on from that, Selaine, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the difference between centrally locally led initiatives versus central planning reforms. Things like 20-minute neighbourhoods, how effective are they at getting people out cycling and walking?
I think there's an opportunity with all of those things for people to actually change behaviour, but it is very much going to depend on where you are in the country, what your population's like, and how well designed your networks are that you're using. So I think it's something that we hear good reports of. I don't have much experience in my constituency of that type of thing, but as we are looking at some of the redevelopments going through to really see what active travel solutions that we can put into town centres to enable these things to take place. And so I'm still a district councillor as well, and it was my district council that brought forward the VOI proposals and actually were able to initiate that. So I think it is really about that local knowledge and sort of getting into where you can do these things and it will work, because if you look at Barnstable on the outside as a population, you know, with an older than average profile, you wouldn't put us down as a great place to have a voice scooter trial, but actually our higher education college have led on it, and it's meant that students can now actually have independence and get to work and get to town afterwards and get between the campuses in a way that they couldn't before. So it's also, I think, for young people in a rural location, giving them a huge opportunity to actually be part of a change in trend and mode and be at the front of something, rather than quite often, like with buses, we tend to be at the back of the queue.
Great. Have we got any more questions? This gentleman in the front here.
We talk about the managed decline of roads, but the managed decline of bus services, especially ones supported by local councils, has been a real problem, especially in Cheshire. I live in a very rural part of Cheshire, in between two quite big towns, but there's no bus service after 6:30. Even 5 years ago, the councils were supporting them to go up to 9:30 or maybe 10:30. We've actually got, in the village I live in, we've got the best pub in the northwest of England. But because people can't get home, genuinely, but because people can't get home by bus, you see taxis pulling up every 10 minutes, and actually, one bus an hour taking them back to Northwich or taking them back to Winsford could be a real good answer, when actually they're only spending £5 on a bus ticket and not £15 on a bus ticket to get there and a taxi fare to get back home. So would that not actually help to contribute to the local economy more by investing a little bit more money? And I know council budgets are really stretched, but this is one of the key things to mobilise people, I would say. Great,
yeah. Maybe Jonathan, if you could talk a little bit about bus services, and then perhaps Baroness Vere on linking up the urban and rural areas as well.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, an interesting one, isn't it? Look, I thoroughly believe we've got to do the absolute best to deliver the best bus services through West Northampton and everywhere, really. That's a big part of reducing carbon. An interesting example, your pub one. I mean, your pub one will be a commercial enterprise, and you wonder whether there's an opportunity for them to deliver that service. I only say that because when you look at the number of routes that lose money, that's part of the problem we have, isn't it, really? I mean, it's that classic chicken and egg, but fewer people are using the buses, and part of that is because there is a poorer and poorer service wherever we can now with council money. We tend not to just throw it at the full cost of the problem. You try and leverage a number of alternatives in, and I wonder if that's the solution there. I think broadly that's probably the key point of it, the increasing cost, the increasing requirement of subsidy, the loss of the 106 money that came for a new bus service when a new development was created that no longer supports it, and so on. I suppose these are some of the issues we're tackling, I guess.
Great, thank you.
Buses are obviously very dear to my heart and to the Prime Minister's heart as well. What's the pub called?
It's called the Ryan.
Okay, very good pitch. So, I mean, at the end of the day, buses are going to be local decisions. They must be. And the government will do everything we can to support them. Now, we set quite an ambitious target for the bus service improvement plans. We basically said to local authorities, you have to get them in by the 31st of October, to which a few, sucked their teeth and went, oh, we've got full council on the 4th of September. It's not going to work, that timetable. And part of me sort of died inside. Because if we do not have agile local government that is able to, fit in with, I mean, yes, it's an ambitious timetable, but actually it was more than 6 months. It's just sort of encouraging this sort of ambition, this speed of change. Because if there's one thing we know is that life post-COVID is probably not going to be like life pre-COVID, but we don't know why, and we don't know how. And so we do have to shuffle bus services around. There's going to be all sorts of things that we're going to need to do. And the other thing that the government did last year was invest £20 million in demand-responsive transport. And I'm thinking, things like your pub and other sort of rural areas where they might have a certain, thing at night that people like going to, DRT might be a good thing. So we will find out from that £20 million in those pilots. And then the key thing that we've got to get for the local authorities is for them all to learn from each other. They mustn't keep the knowledge just in the DRT areas, share the knowledge, so we'll have our bus centre of excellence, and people can go in there and learn about what other people learnt, which would be great.
Great answers. Jack, there's a gentleman over on that side of the room.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm a big fan of the electric scooter model, and I'm really glad to hear of the extension. Matt has already mentioned the illegal private uses of e-scooters, and my question to the panel is, would you support the legalisation of the usage of e-scooters to privately owned e-scooters, given that they're already being used as such, and also given that at least one of the, I think, the bigger perceived drawbacks of e-scooters is the perception of street clutter, which would surely be alleviated if people owned their scooter in the same way that you own your bicycle. And with that in mind, I'd also ask Matt if any of the trials support those conclusions.
Interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think definitely if we start with Matthew, we might work our way down the panel. But you also touched on something that I think will be really helpful to discuss or talk about, is about the street clutter. And that leads to, I think, an important conversation on the accessibility of urban travel, and particularly making sure that, as Selaine mentioned earlier, people who might be partially sighted or use guide dogs, that their street clutter doesn't get in the way of them accessing urban travel. But yeah, the legal point is really interesting. Perhaps, Matthew, if we start and we'll work our way down this side of the panel.
So if I start on what are currently illegal private e-scooters, I think our view is they clearly are going to be part of the mix going forward. Several 100,000 of these have been imported, and we see them every day, and they are, however, at the moment, unregulated and illegal. But if properly regulated, and however the government thinks that through, clearly that's better than in another car. And as part of the options of people to travel around in a more sustainable way. But I think it's very important that there's a level playing field between the rental models and the private ones. The problem with the private ones is because they're currently unregulated, there is no insurance. Ours are insured. We don't know what sort of nick they're in. Ours are maintained very rigorously to make sure they're fit and roadworthy. And of course the private ones aren't. So there needs to be a way, and they can also be, some of them can be hacked to go extremely quickly. So ours are, in fact, the regulations are 15.5 miles an hour, but ours can only go up to 12.5 miles an hour. So these are not super speedy vehicles, our ones. Some of the private ones can be. So I think it's important that the government thinks they're part of that smorgasbord of options, but there are impacts of people potentially going very quickly on unsafe vehicles that aren't insured, and that probably needs to be looked at. When it comes to the point about clutter and street clutter, we've worked very hard with our councils to really, really mitigate that. So we've got partnerships with the RNIB and a visually impaired charity called the Thomas Pocklington Trust in order to ensure that we really mitigate the impacts that having scooters parked could create. So we have things like we design special racks which help visually impaired people to see. And we've also brought in some product requirements. So when you end a ride, you need to take a photograph to show that you've parked it properly. So you've got to show properly the edge of the pavement, so there's enough space for wheelchair users or for buggy pushers to go past. And if you don't, you can end up, you get told off and eventually get a fine. And that has hugely increased. You're looking at our... No, not you, the gentleman in the front.
I didn't realise you had to get the edge of the pavement in. I've had a few emails.
You've got a few, okay. No, I must say, in fair...
Your wife is going to be so upset with you.
I keep picking... can I have your name? Because I keep picking on you. What's your name? Daniel. So, in fairness to Daniel, I'm only the head of policy. I'm only the head of policy for Vere, and I've had a rude email from my own company because I didn't know that either. So there you go. You're not alone. Yes, you do need to get the edge of the pavement, because it's viewed by a human. It's not a machine that looks at the picture, so they can see that there is space for other road users, vulnerable road users, pavement users, I should say, to easily and safely go past and not have to step into the street or anything like that. But I think also we would call on councils, in fact, because we are displacing so many car journeys, that the right places to park these things are on the odd parking space. So what we would like from councils is to be able to turn what was a parking spot into, which will park one car, which can park 12 of our scooters. And that gets them off the pavement, so you essentially eliminate any danger of misparked scooters, because clearly sometimes they are misparked. And we want to reduce that to 0. We reduced it hugely, so our parking compliance is in the 90% now, but getting that to 100 would be great, and that's really only realistically done by having the odd parking space on the street. And it is incidentally what they've done in London, where they've carved out parking spaces for the trial that's happening in the capital.
So do I support the use of private e-scooters? Yes, I do. And I think, we've clearly got to work it through. Matthew has really clearly highlighted some of the challenges we face. And this is part of the point of the trials, obviously, to work through some of those challenges. It may be that the trials don't work at all and we don't do it, but at the moment it doesn't feel like that. So I would expect we might make progress on this in the Future Transport Bill. But again, it's all still subject to the outcomes of the pilots, which is the whole point of them. But in general, I think we've got to move in the direction. We've got to embrace new technology. And it may not just be e-scooters. There may be other things that are coming down the track as well that we might want to embrace. We've got to look at all of the eventualities.
Great, thanks. Selaine?
I don't think I have anything to add on that, actually. I'm relatively supportive of them, but I do think we need to come up with some form of enforcement, and I think the more people that are undertaking active travel, it's like anything in life. If we've got rules and regs, we do actually need some form of enforcement to make sure that they're actually followed and adhered to.
Yeah, thank you. Again, not much to add. Only to say that, like everybody here, I think I'd love to see people travelling by electric e-scooters, as a carbon reduction measure. I have those same concerns at the moment to use, if you like an authorised scooter scheme, you have to have a driving licence, you have to be of a certain age, and so on. And it's a little bit like the minicab thing, isn't it? No booking, no insurance sort of thing. Obviously, the e-scooters are insured, so you've got an element of safety. I know that you can jump on a bicycle at any age and go on the road, can't you? But somehow, I can't quite square away whether we should be more at the bicycle end of that or whether we're more at the motorised vehicle end of it. I'm not quite sure, but I would love to see a way that increase the number of scooters being used. Thank you.
Do we have any more questions? I don't know where the microphone is anymore. Oh, there you are. The first hand I saw up was gentleman in the back left.
Hi, you've given us a great story about the reduction of car journeys, but I was just wondering if you could tell us the average trip length of a scooter trip. And then secondly, second part to my question is how much are you supporting your markets with cycling infrastructure, for example? So, for example, in Birmingham, how much are you supporting them with, be it installing parking racks or maybe segregating bits so that scooters can use them more easily?
Great, thank you. I think, Matthew, if you could come in on the e-scooters.
E-scooters tend to be used for fairly short journeys, so it's around 2 kilometres plus or so. Interesting, where we have e-bikes operating, which is in Cambridge and Kettering, they tend to be a bit longer journeys. So you can see when it comes to, I can use the word smorgasbord again, there's different options of sustainable mobility that arguably should be on the streets in order to encourage people out of their cars. You can see there's sort of different options, different courses essentially. So scooters perhaps the relatively shortish ones, but then the e-bikes for slightly longer. And they also have slightly different demographics, as you might expect. The e-bikes tend to have slightly older users and the scooters slightly younger. Although, as I said earlier, that is actually increasing in age, our user base. When it comes to cycling infrastructure, I know from my time at London City Hall how expensive putting cycling infrastructure is. So I don't think it's up to a micromobility operator to do that. I should pay for it. But clearly it's our role to support that and to, I suppose, work with the council on how that should go forward. And I just saw in the newspaper yesterday, so the cabinet lead for Birmingham City Council, Councillor Zaffer, it's Labour Council, but Transport West Midlands is controlled by Andy Street, is talking about, I know these aren't necessarily university popular, but it's sort of a big low traffic neighbourhood for large parts of Birmingham. Now, clearly, it would seem to me that the only way you can do that is by giving people a lot of options which isn't the car. And in fairness to Councillor Zaffa, he said he's a Vore user, so obviously I was quite pleased by reading this article. But the point I'm trying to say is, he can't go and do that realistically at the scale of Birmingham, which obviously its history is car town, without offering a great deal of different options, one of which is clearly Vore, but also, of course, Andy Street has brought in, I can't say Boris bikes, Andy bikes, or whatever you call them, into Birmingham, and they're very successful too. And I'm just going to abuse my position, so I've got the conch in my hand, that it's interesting that they don't cannibalise each other, because they're used for slightly different journeys. We've seen in the markets such as Birmingham and Liverpool, where they both have a cycle hire scheme and Vore, that you haven't seen one eating the other. And they're quite complementary to give residents different options of how to travel about.
So, Matthew, can I just connect you? Birmingham is not a car town. Historically, it's had Hercules cycles and BSA cycles there. So it's producing cycles before it had cars.
I stand corrected.
Thanks. Selaine, I reckon you have some pretty good insight into cycling infrastructure.
So the APPG has just completed an inquiry into the next phase of cycling and walking investment strategy. And one of the things that came through very clearly from that is that the industry, and we did hear a lot of evidence coming back, feel that although they're very grateful for the amount of money already on the table, that actually if we want to achieve the kind of change in behaviour that we're seeking as we run to net zero, we are going to need more money than is currently on the table. And I think that it is something that we need to consider and actually match our ambitions with the budget. And I think we also need to be realistic. My response was, well, obviously the budget could be a bit tight right now as we recover from the pandemic, and therefore I think we need to sort of manage those expectations so that the two need to actually move in harmony between the budget and the investment, so that we actually end up with the right infrastructure in the right places.
Great. I think we have time for maybe one short, very brief question. Someone got a short question? I think this lady in the front has got a short question. Oh, 1 second.
Oh, sorry, thank you. Basically, I come from the city of Preston, which is a small city, and our council has been very keen on retail parks. They're actually killing the city centre. So now, if I want to go to Marks and Spencer, I have to go to the retail park where I can park free. If I go in the city centre, I have to pay. If I want to then go on to net, I go to one car park, a retail car park, shopping centre, then I drive across town to another shopping centre. I personally hate retail parks. I think they should really embrace the city centre. It's a small city. I don't really feel our council is really working well with our county council. They're trying to make the city centre pedestrian car free, but there's not going to be much point if there's no shops in the city centre. They're all spread around the city. What's your feeling on retail parks, basically?
Baroness Vere, do you have some strong opinions on retail parks?
I'm not sure I'm allowed to have strong opinions on retail parks. Bays would probably kill me. But I do think what is really, really important is, firstly, for the different layers of local authorities work together. And sometimes one might assume that there's just too many layers of local authorities, but let's not go there. I'm not allowed to comment on that either. But what is really, really important is that spatial and economic plans must match in with the local transport plan. And if they, if it is the case that high streets are going to, empty out shops to retail parks, is okay, well, what are you going to do there instead? And it could be that it's the right decision for a certain area if they are able to bring in lots of experiences, lots of restaurants, a different way of a different type of vibe for the high street. And again, that would have to be matched with a really good local transport plan. Can I just very quickly go back to Selaine's point about money? I mean, the Prime Minister did pledge £5 billion for buses and for cycling and walking, and I think we eventually said £2 billion roughly will be for cycling and walking. I think that's quite a lot. So we haven't obviously dished all that out yet, and subject to confirmation at spending review. I think there is a fair amount of investment both in buses, cycling and walking, and I hope in many other forms of transport as well.
Fantastic. I think we're coming to the end here, so I'm just going to invite each of our panellists to give a short answer to the question, what is transport in our urban areas going to look like in 2030? Jonathan, do you want to kick us off with what you would like to see? 2030,
I would like to see us carbon neutral, and given that a significant amount of our carbon comes from transport, that's got to see significant changes. We see more people living in our town as part of that change to town and the conflict with out-of-town shopping, more people living within our towns to bring vibrancy, but also meaning they live near their place of work. They perhaps travel less. When they do travel, they travel by public transport or sustainable transport. That would be my vision for Northampton and West Northamptonshire for 2030. Thank you.
Yeah, very similar, just to ensure that people have the different modes available to them, and as we head towards net zero, that they are decarbonised. So I think a big push on electric charging points at this point in time. So for those journeys that you can't do or any other way, you are at least it's a zero carbon journey when you go.
Baroness Vere?
Well, at the reshuffle, there was only one change in the Department for Transport. And this may be a good thing or it may be a bad thing, because what's happened over the last couple of years, whilst the team's been in place, we've written a lot of strategies. We've got a strategy for everything. We've got some great strategies, and now we've got to deliver them. So I'm hoping that we've all been kept in place so that we can take our strategies and actually deliver them. And I think by 2030, we will have seen a substantial change to transport in urban centres. I don't think that the job will be completely done, but I do think it will look substantially different. I think the biggest challenge we have is taking people with us.
Wonderful. And Matthew?
It's quite fun when you got one of these sort of future forecasting questions to just think, what was it like 10 years ago? So 10 years ago, now I'm a Londoner, and watched as the Boris bikes were delivered. So they had arrived by 2011, 2010, but Uber hadn't. And nor had there been this massive increase in online shopping. And you've really seen, and e-scooters and the technology that can deliver the sort of dockless bicycles or scooters or whatever it might be, technology had not arrived either. So it's quite fun then to think in 10 years' time, what new stuff would have been invented that, in fact, Charlotte's referred to several times. We don't know what's coming down the track. So that's a sort of a known unknown, I guess. But I think what we'll definitely see is a proliferation of this sort of mass of mobility as a service, where people have a variety of options on their phone, from getting the bus or the tram in Manchester or the tube in London, or some of the DRT that the Minister referred to, or the micromobility options that Voi and our competitors provide. I think we will see an increasing acceleration in the reduction in driving licenses taken up by younger people. As these options come through, you'll see, I think, less individual car ownership over time, which is what we want to see. And the government wants 50% of journeys to be done by sustainable modes by 2030. I would like to be optimistic and say it's going to happen. I think it's a great push target, without a doubt. And if the government can pull the right levers and bring people with them. And I think there was a question about consultation around some of these things. So when it comes to LTNs, for example, some of the pushback has been because they landed almost out of outer space, and without any consultation, and people got understandably upset. But if you consult people and take them with you, then I think a lot is deliverable very quickly, in fact. And it's remarkable how micromobility certainly can land in no time at all. Government decided in May, we arrived in September. So most transport stuff takes a long time. This was pretty quick. So technology can enable change quite fast, but we do need to bring people with us, and that does mean consultation. But that does mean you can do radical things, but consultatively, there are always going to be a loud number of people who don't like change, don't like new things. It's important not to allow a loud minority to veto good policy, and you can mitigate that by talking to people and consulting to them. And this is where elected politicians have a very important role in sort of bringing people along on what is not going to be the easiest journey, but it can be done. That was quite long. Sorry, Lynsey.
Wonderful. No, thank you very much to our fantastic panel, to Jonathan, to Selaine, to Baroness Vere, and to Matthew. And thank you in particular to Voi, again, for sponsoring this. Please do stick around. Actually, our last event later is at 6:30 p.m. In conversations with Stanley Johnson and George Eustace, so should be entertaining. If you haven't already signed up to be a SEND supporter or a SEND counsellor, please do stick around as well, and we'll sign you up for all our exclusive info. Let's give our panel a round of applause.